going to, I always love to have a conversation, a Q&A or comments and so forth, but it works better on Zoom if I put it at specific times, not just throughout the talk. So about half or a little bit more than halfway through my presentation, I'll stop for a pause. And if anybody needs a bio break, that's fine. But the pause will also be an opportunity for you to make any comments or have any questions for me. So we'll do that so towards the middle and then at the very end of the hour presentation. So I'm starting with a work of art of CHRISTO and Jean-Claude, which I hope some of you, maybe all of you, are familiar with, because it happened here in the Bay Area, or let us say the North Bay Area. And this was Running Fence, which went 25.5 miles across the farmland and the countryside, both of Marin County and Sonoma County. And I'm showing you a partial map on the left-hand screen, which shows you how it hip-scopped and curled and jumped around over the landscape before finally disappearing into the Pacific Ocean. Raise your hand if you remember Running Fence or had some kind of experience of it back in the 70s. Yeah, so we have a few hands there. I did not live in California at that time, so I was aware of it, but I did not experience it firsthand. But that's the reason that I'm starting with Running Fence, because it's kind of our local star in terms of the work that CHRISTO and Jean-Claude did. So let me say a little bit about the Running Fence. I'll say much more about the artist and his wife, collaborator Jean-Claude, a little bit later.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I was working at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art when they did this, so I remember seeing them, and I don't think we went up there, but I think they visited us or something.
Oh, very good. So they gave some kind of a presentation probably.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So here you have one of many, many photographs taken, and I love the way it sort of dances across the across the landscape there. And you see in another kind of shot how on the left it disappears into the ocean, and you can see in the far left there some kind of a boat which is holding the tie line that kind of keeps it from all crumbling down together. And then on the right is one of literally thousands of preparatory drawings which CHRISTO did to prepare for this. Now, you remember when I put the first slide, I said 1972 to 1976. Well, as most of you are aware, if you have any familiarity with CHRISTO, you know that the work of art itself, what he called the hardware phase, was only up for a couple of weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks, and then it was gone. So to say that it's 4 years only means that that's how long it took to design it, get all the right permissions, and the permissions in this case from all the farmers that owned the property over which the Running Fence ran. And so it was only that last part of 76 for a couple of weeks that it was actually on view. And I have a friend who was teaching, I think, primary school at that time, and she said that they were very well organized. They took tour buses up there with the kids to see the thing itself, and so I guess it was really organized so that you could actually see it and not just in those airplane photographs like the ones I've been showing you. And of course, here's CHRISTO himself standing by his masterwork. And here you see two pictures of the installation of the piece with a huge number of volunteers as well as paid people that you see in the photo on the left, stringing up the curtain sort of like you know, like bath curtains. That was a kind of nylon fabric that he used here. And you can see how it was guy wired at the bottom, so it wouldn't just be flapping around in the wind. Although there's certainly a lot of movement, which is part of the beauty of the piece, as the wind passed through and around. So now we're going back in time. As I say, I wanted to start with Running Fence because it was a work that was would have been familiar to many of you since it happened here or fairly locally back in the 1970s. So I want to talk a little bit about this unusual partnership. CHRISTO and Jean-Claude were born on the same day in 1935, June 13th, but in very different places. Jean-Claude is French by birth, but she was born in Morocco. And then CHRISTO himself, Javashev, it's his legal last name, was born in Eastern Europe, which was at that time communist. And so he had a very strict kind of academic art training there. And, but he had managed to escape first to Vienna and then finally to Paris. And the way that they met is kind of an interesting story in and of itself. This would have been about the time that you see in this photograph back in the 1960s, or possibly the late 50s when they first met. CHRISTO was hired by Jean-Claude's mother to paint her portrait. And that's how they met, very romantic. The other story that's routinely told about Jean-Claude is that she's from a military family. She was not in the military herself, but many commentators use that as a way of explaining how she became to have a very, very important part in their partnership as CHRISTO went from small little wrapped objects to these very large environmental pieces. Because she was the organizer par excellence. She knew how to draft people, and she knew how to deal with all the paperwork, sometimes the political aspect of the projects that we were working on. And so he could be free to be the artistic part of the partner, and she was the business end. And so it was really, not only were they clearly soulmates in every way, but it was a wonderful business partnership and artistic partnership as well. So there you see them on the right, probably from a picture from the 1990s. Now, you may know that the reason that I chose to talk about CHRISTO today instead of the topic which I originally proposed is because he died just last month in May. Jean-Claude died a number of years ago in 2009, and so he had to soldier on with his projects without her. I sometimes wonder, you know, how that worked, because she was such an important part of the team. But in any case, he died at the age of 84 just more than a month ago. So that's why I thought it would be really appropriate to celebrate their life and his work in this way. So now I will show you and talk about a number of his pieces more or less in a chronological order. And so some of the early pieces that he was doing when he was still living in Paris, when they were newly married, were a whole series of wrapping objects. I think the largest object that he wrapped as a work of art was a Volkswagen Beetle. But here on the left, you see a portrait packaged up in this kind of deliberately clumsy kind of way. And the portrait that you barely see through there is actually a portrait of Jean-Claude. Then on the right is a very mysterious looking object, which takes some explaining. but it's important to understand the history of it because it plays directly into some of CHRISTO's thinking back in the days. This is an object which the American artist Man Ray made way back in 1920. Man Ray was living in Paris and he was part of the Surrealist, the French Surrealist movement. And he created this object, which he then photographed, and it was the photograph that really became the object itself rather than the image that you see here. And so CHRISTO, as well as many other artists of his generation, Paris in the 60s was, had its own version of pop art, like what was happening in this country. And so let's take a closer look at this strange, mysterious object that so captured the imagination, not only of the Surrealists back in the 20s and 30s, but once again by the French pop artist in the 1960s. It was Breton, who was the ringleader of the French Surrealists, who discovered this very obscure, very little known author, Isidore Ducasse, who took on the fancy name of Le Comte de l'Autremont. And he wrote a short, very short book called The Song of Maldoror, or The Chant de Maldoror, which is published way back in 1868. What the Surrealists zeroed in on, and then the pop artists of the 60s also tuned into, was one quote from this book, which I've written out here. As beautiful as the chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. So that's kind of like a recipe for Surrealist activity of bringing together odd things that have no business being together. But then Man Ray takes it one step further and further obscures the whole thing by wrapping it up in an old flannel blanket in a kind of a higgledy-piggledy kind of fashion. So that was very intriguing and really sort of inspired CHRISTO's early wrapped pieces. Now, another aspect of pop art, both here in this country as well as in France, was choosing everyday objects to make art. And the absurdity of everyday objects being kind of highlighted. On the left, you see a work from about the same period in the 1960s by the American pop artist Claus Oldenburg. This sagging toilet made out of vinyl is kind of falling apart, obviously not very useful. And then on the right is a shopping cart by CHRISTO that he's wrapped sort of in the manner of Man Ray in a kind of a messy, higgledy-piggledy kind of way. So these wrappings were some of his early works, but very modest in scale compared to some of the wrappings from his later period. However, his very first real environmental work was also while he was still living in Paris from 1962. And unlike any of the other big environmental pieces that he later made, this one was done by the dark of the moon with no permissions from the city. And so they had to put it up quickly and take it down, photograph it quickly. So he very tongue-in-cheek called this the Iron Curtain. And of course, this was still very much before the unification of Germany and the taking down of the Berlin Wall. And so they chose a very narrow street, an old street, Rue Visconti, and put these oil barrels, empty oil barrels, stacked up. So it obviously stopped traffic, but did that matter in the middle of the night? So there you have it. It's the only evidence that remains of this Iron Curtain are the photographs that were taken at the time. But it wasn't long before CHRISTO, whom you see on the left with one of his wrappings, that he went from wrapping these small objects, manageable objects, to wrapping whole landscapes. And that's what you're looking at on the right, is whole rugged, jagged cliffside, which was way down in Australia in a part of the cliff side going down into the Pacific, which is near the city of Sydney. So this was started in '68. That would have been what he called the software phase of the design and the drawings, and this time with many permissions, of course, from the powers that be in Australia. And because he couldn't very well have kept this hidden, could he? Like he did the oil barrels on Rue Visconti. So I'm showing you two pictures here. This is a very fine artist taking control on the left-hand side. That's, of course, CHRISTO that you're looking at there. And then part of his team, these people would have had to have been rappellers, skilled rappellers, in order to be clambering up and down the cliff, securing the cloth that wrapped this section of the cliff that you're seeing there. So keep that in mind. This was his first big environmental piece. I don't think the Iron Curtain quite qualifies of that, but it's certainly busting out of that small, manageable package size wrappings that we first saw. 68 to 69. So that was done quite quickly compared to some of his later pieces that very often took decades between the first design and the final execution. Meanwhile, while he was actually executing the wrapped cliffs there, he was beginning the design phase of the first piece that he did on the continental United States. And that was his Valley Curtain. So he was already starting the planning of that when he was working in Australia, but it was only accomplished in 1972. Well, he learned a lot from the Valley Curtain, which went across the Rifle Valley Gap in Colorado. And you can, if you can make out the photograph on the left, you can see that there's a road that passes around here and actually goes through the gap there. I mean, that's what gaps are about. You put a road to it. And of course, the Valley Curtain accommodated that with kind of an archway so that the traffic was not impeded. Well, they obviously learned a lot from the disaster that happened here because the wind really ripped it apart after a few days. So it stayed up a shorter time than probably what was originally planned, but still in all, it was intended to be a temporary work. And this is a good time to talk about what meaning that has for CHRISTO's large environmental works that we're going to be looking at in more detail from now on out. That was one of the, I would say, foundational principles of his work, that it be temporary, no matter how large and elaborate and so forth, and that it not disturb or damage the landscape, or in some case the building that was being wrapped or otherwise decorated. And so it took a lot of planning, not only for the visuals like what you see here with the Valley Curtain, like this beautiful orangey red against the greens and blues of the natural landscape of Colorado. It goes way beyond the aesthetics to, first of all, a study of the impact, the environmental impact it might have on the landscape, and figuring out ways to mitigate that, both before, during, and after the installation. And also having to negotiate with whomever the governmental authorities were and whomever owned the land, which was certainly crucial in the case of Running Fence in Marin and Sonoma, because they crossed the line, the property line of some 50 different farmers, and that each one had to be negotiated. And these people didn't necessarily have a clue about who is this person and what is this form of art, because this is where the creativity of CHRISTO and Jean-Claude really comes to bear, that they really were creating a new kind of art. There was other kind of environmental art happening about this time, and especially in the 80s, like DeMaria and some of the other environmental artists. But CHRISTO was alone in making it part of his credo that it be temporary and not a permanent aspect of the landscape. And so just to remind you how Running Fence fits into this chronology, he was starting the planning for that in '72, which is when the Valley Curtain was installed. So he was already overlapping one project to another. And that was the case most of his life, that as he was going into the hardware phase of one project, he was doing the software planning and so forth for the next project coming along. Wow, what a difference. From the Valley Curtain to Running Fence, now we're back in the water. This is called Surrounded Islands, and it's in the Biscayne Bay of Miami, which is, I'll show you in a map in just a moment. It's the bay that goes between Miami Beach and the mainland of Miami proper. And so it's, as water goes, it's fairly protected. And in fact, it was originally intended as a kind of a inland waterway to connect up the coast of Florida. Now you'll notice in contrast to the cliffside in Australia, or the Valley Curtain, or the Running Fence, those three that we looked at so far, that they really are much more sculptural, and they kind of conform to the landscape and actually show up the landscape with its different forms and movements. This, by contrast, is quite flat. So think about that for a moment. And think of any other painter who he might have been looking at or thinking about. I'm told that it was Jean-Claude who first suggested this idea of the surrounded islands, which is, I think, the best views are from the air. Both of these pictures were taken probably from a helicopter or whatever. So you really get to see the high view looking down and the flatness of these pink lily pads. So one of the things you've noticed is that if we think of these as lilies and lily pads, he's reversed the colors, right? So the green trees in the center, which are the flower, reverse the coloration, and the pads and the leaves are this bright, very artificial pink that you see here. And there you have it. He was thinking of Monet and Monet's late water lilies. So I'm making a comparison here between one of Monet's paintings from his late period, from the lily pads in his own garden that he created in his home. And then this is a great picture on the right where you see these there were actually 11 of these surrounded islands marching down this waterway. We're only seeing 3 or 4 of them here, but he actually did, I think, 10 or 11 altogether. So I find it very interesting that it was Jean-Claude that originally suggested this idea of a flattened out kind of environment rather than something that's more structural or three-dimensional or architectural. And all of those things, of course, will come into play in some of the later pieces here. I think I have one other picture. Yes. Here is not a very good quality map, but it does give a lot of information. This is Miami Beach, of course, with the beach part right there. And so this is the bay, and then off to the right, where you don't see it, would be the mainland. But here you see the lily pads, where my arrow go to, the lily pads marching along that bay between the mainland and Miami Beach. Well, I didn't mean to quite go the next one too fast. On the left is a sample of the fabric that was used on the surrounded islands. And I happened to be in Miami visiting a friend about 6 months before the installation. So I never got to see the installation in person. But I did visit the factory where they were manufacturing these pads. And here is a sample of the fabric that they used. It's kind of a plastic kind of fabric that would float easily. And you can see it's kind of like a coarse basket weave. And there's a purpose in that because it allows air to circulate. It's not like completely closing off the oxygen from the water. And this became very important because like practically all the projects that CHRISTO has done, he and Jean-Claude have gone through a very, very detailed process of studying the impact of whatever their design was. And one of many environmental groups in the Miami area were very concerned about the impact of these pink lily pads on the lives of all the animals there, particularly the manatee, which are very, actually quite numerous in that area. They're kind of a seal. But it was discovered after they did many environmental studies and so forth, that the manatee actually liked being underneath. It gave them enough air, gave them a little privacy. They could kind of noodle, make love and have their own little private area underneath these lily pads. So I found that story quite amusing and beneficial for the environment, evidently. Well, I'm contrasting the playfulness of so many of CHRISTO's works, and certainly that's the case of the surrounded islands, with his colleague, in the sense that he's the same age, and that is Richard Serra, who's on the particular work of Richard Serra's that I'm showing you here. Many of you may have seen because it was installed for, I think, the better part of 2 years, at least a year and a half, in the free space at the new part of the SF MoMA. This very heavy corten steel that has to be physically supported by many tons of cement underneath. And I'm contrasting CHRISTO with Serra here because as one critic describes Serra, he's annoyingly serious. And for sure, Serra is a very serious artist. And so it's one of the trademarks of CHRISTO that he deliberately goes in a very different direction, that he embraces the playfulness. Now, this at times, interestingly enough, has created, shall we say, pushback, criticism, etc., from the art world, because the art world is still used to art being very serious and sometimes very inscrutable and difficult to understand. So along comes CHRISTO and Jean-Claude with these delightful fantasies. And what's not to like? And so that caused some problems at times, not with everybody, but with certain parts of the art world, that it wasn't very serious art because it was easy to take in, to understand, to appreciate, to love. And that is a sentiment that goes through pretty much most of his work. One of my all-time favorite art critics, his name is Peter Sheldal. He's been writing for the New Yorker forever, and I follow him very closely. But he kind of very begrudgingly went to the Gates, which we'll talk about momentarily, which happened, of course, in Central Park in New York. And he kind of sort of sniffed his nose and said, well, okay, this is enjoyable, but he was very reluctant to kind of give a high five to CHRISTO's Gates. And that was, I would say, something like a typical response of some parts, not all parts, of the art world. For myself, I'm all for joy and pleasure when it comes to art. Not that that's the only voice that we need, but I find CHRISTO's works very uplifting. Now, as we progress in terms of time, we find that CHRISTO is coming more and more into the urban scenario, okay? So one of his earliest, in the middle of the city, is the Pont Neuf in Paris. I'm sure those of you who have traveled to Paris probably walked across this bridge. I'm sure, and it's a very ancient bridge, even though it's called the New Bridge, Pont Neuf. It's actually really old. It's the oldest bridge in Paris of the 6 bridges that go across this particular island, the Ile de la Cité. It was opened in 1607, for heaven's sakes. And so it is the oldest bridge, but at that time was the New Bridge, so it's kept that name all those years. And it's obviously in still very sturdy, good condition. So this was completed in 1985. So you can imagine, as he was completing the surrounded islands in 1983, you can imagine that the planning for Pont Neuf was well developed, and probably a lot of the permissions were already happening and taking place. It would have to have been, because the more CHRISTO got into an urban environment, probably the more negotiation, the more permissions and so forth, and more backs that had to be padded, more of that sort of negotiation had to happen as he became, his projects came into the urban landscape. So again, one of the thousands of drawings that he did here. And this is a good point in the presentation to point out, how did he pay for all this? Another point of pride for CHRISTO and Jean-Claude is that they never took grant money or any other kind of governmental support. And in other words, all their projects were self-funded. And the way they were funded was, importantly, through the creation of these drawings and prints made from the drawings and books that were published on each one of the major works. And so they had this whole cottage industry, you could say, to one side, which completely funded these large projects, which of course cost millions of dollars, each one of them. So here we are in the heart of Paris, because let me show you the next slide. Here is the Ile de la Cité, which is really kind of like the sacred heart, not only of Paris, but you could say all of France. On the back end of it is Notre Dame Cathedral, which of course burned and made a lot of headlines just not too long ago. And at the other end is the Pont Neuf. That's the bridge that you see here at the very western end of the Ile de la Cité. And then on the right, you see, again, one of the many preparatory drawings he did showing what it would look like when when the bridge was finally wrapped. And you can see from these pictures by day and by evening, it's very interesting. The fabric that they chose had a reflective quality, which actually changed the light, changed color as the ambient light changed, whether it was a gray overcast day or a bright sunshine day. In the evening, the city lights reflecting off of the surface. But you could see that the traffic was not in any way impeded. You see people and cars and all the rest walking across the bridge there, and you see the bateau mouche. I bet some of you have taken those little tour boats around in the Seine. It's a delightful way to take in the heart of Paris. And so I think it's a moment for us to reflect on how CHRISTO really chose a monument, the Pont Neuf, not only for its sculptural and architectural beauty and interest, but also the history of this bridge, being an old bridge and much honored by French people and by Parisians. And of course, the connecting the Ile de la Cité, which is the kind of the heart, you could say, of Paris. And here, yet again, another comparison with the one of the sketches, one of the preparatory drawings, with the bridge itself before it was covered. Now I want to make a little sidebar here to another monument, which is also on the Ile de la Cité at the other end. Now remember, this is at one end, the western end is the Pont Neuf, which is where CHRISTO's wrapped bridge was. And totally at the other end is, and that would be at the eastern end of Notre Dame. We could call that the sacred of the sacred spots. There's an underground passageway that takes you to the Monument au Déporté, which was finished in 1962. It reminds me a little bit of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. You can't see it, but along the walls here are inscribed the thousands and thousands of names of French people who were deported to the Nazi camps and crematoria in Eastern Europe. And so it's very interesting that went forward too soon. It's very interesting that they chose to put this underground monument, so it feels very tomb-like, on one of the most sacred places of Paris and by extension France. So just think of those at the two kind of opposite ends of the Ile de la Cité. So that's just a little sidebar there. So this is a CHRISTO quote. All the energy of the project is revealed through the permitting process. So that's, and he said variations of this throughout his life, as well as did Jean-Claude, who was the top negotiator very often. Because it was very important for him to make it understood to his many publics that the finished work was almost a byproduct almost, not quite. But the permitting process, which is where, and the negotiation and so forth, what he called the software aspect of the project, was where the real nitty-gritty, where the real energy lay. And as we've already seen, sometimes it took many years. And certainly it took decades for the project for the Reichstag in Berlin to be accomplished. Now we're going to see in just a moment the Reichstag, which we see on the left with the German flag of the unified Germany flying from all parapets and around the building. So we'll see it wrapped in just a moment, but I want to take, and also to compare it with other buildings, because we're getting into from other kinds of architecture, we're getting into whole buildings that he wrapped. There's only one big building that I know of before the Reichstag that he wrapped. It's not this. This is the old Whitney Museum, which is now the Met Breuer on Madison Avenue in New York. This was a project, what you're looking at on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side. But he did complete one other museum project, wrapping for the Chicago Art Institute. No, not the Art Institute, the Contemporary Art Museum in Chicago, where he wrapped the floors as well as the outside of the building. But here I'm showing you the project for the Whitney, which was not completed, I should hasten to add. But before we look at the completed wrapping of the Reichstag, I want to remind you of a little history there, because once again, I think it's important for us to understand how CHRISTO really took in a very large aspect. And it wasn't just about the architecture or about the sculptural qualities or the visuals and so forth. It was really about the history as well. This, of course, was the German parliament, and it was built in the 19th century. And I remind people that Germany was one of the very last countries to actually be unified. It was a bunch of little sort of provinces always arguing with each other until pretty late into the 19th century. France and Italy had been unified earlier. And so the Reichstag was a very important symbol of that unification with a parliament. This was the parliament building, so representing parliamentary democracy and so forth, which was then burned by Hitler in 1933. And of course, he took power immediately after that. And so obviously the building was not being used. And of course, he didn't want to have anything to do with parliamentary democracy anyway. And then, of course, the Russians claimed that part of Berlin at the end of the Second World War. So it was still kind of not, it was a, shall we say, a false monument, because it certainly did not stand for any kind of unity or unification as it does today. So along comes CHRISTO, and in 1976, when he started the planning, it still, of course, was a very divided city. He has a lot of chutzpah, wouldn't you say? To take this on and say, okay, I'm going to get the eastern side and the western part of Berlin together and talking and negotiating so that they will wrap this building together and so forth. So I think it took, just a lot of bravery and chutzpah on his part to start that early. But of course, it didn't actually happen until 1995, which was almost 6 years after finally, Germany was unified. But he was working during that whole time. So you could say that he was, trying to be something of a unifier, a peacemaker in his own fashion. What you're seeing here in the foreground, of course, is the Brandenburg Gate, and the detail of these this chariot you see on the top there, which looks across to the Parliament building itself. And it became a great celebratory rallying place, as you can see from the thousands of crowds that gathered together. And of course, again, this was only up for 3 weeks and then it was taken down. But people gathered even as the wrapping was happening and going on, because it took quite a bit to wrap this whole building. You can see crowds of thousands of people here. And by day, looks like this is an early morning shot. And then by night, it was, as you've seen from the Pont Neuf, CHRISTO was also always very attuned to the shifting in color and what light, natural as well as artificial light, would do to the surfaces that of his wrappings.
Josephine,
Yes.
could you know what kind of fabric or material he used
Um,
on Reichstag?
Right, on the Reichstag. I can't answer that in a specific kind of way, but just know that he did very extensive research each time for each piece, because they had different requirements. That's an excellent question, which I cannot answer with any specificity. I'm sorry. But thanks for the question anyway.
Yes.
And here are the two of them with photographs of the construction and what he would call the hardware phase of the building, the Reichstag. And on the right, I find this a fascinating picture, because it looks like it was kind of an overcast day, and look how different the color is. It's kind of a gray, chalky, it doesn't look reflective at all. And then all the thousands of people coming up all around. So this is a moment that we can take just a few minutes break.
Yes.
And if you need to take a break, that's great. Well, excuse me, let's say just 4 or 5 minutes, not more than that, because we're, wanting to get on. But if you have any questions or any more comments that you'd like to make, welcome.
Josephine?
Yes.
My name is Marion, and I'm wondering about the memorial tunnel that you showed us on the Ile.
Oh, yes. It's
did
not a tunnel exactly, but
CHRISTO have anything to do with that?
No. That goes back to, and I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten the name of the architect. It was an architect who did it, but that goes back to 1962, and that would have definitely been a French architect. And I know it would be very easy to look that up in Wikipedia under the Monument aux Déportés, and because that would have much more information about the building of it and who the designer was and so forth. I was as I mentioned when we were looking at that, I mentioned that I was very minded of the Vietnam Memorial, which of course is much later in the 70s. And at one point, I met Mylin at a conference, and I asked her if she was familiar, because it, has some of the same elements of more memorializing people through their names in a very kind of confined space. And interestingly enough, she had never heard of that monument. So anyway, I just put that in there. But you could do your own research on Wikipedia and find out who the architect was, because I'm sure it was an architect. That much and it's 1962, that part I remember. Other questions or comments? Okay, so we'll just take 1 or 2 more minutes and we will then continue. Just watching the time here because I don't want to go too far over. Bob, I love your background of the northern lights kind of swimming across the screen there. Can you hear me, Bob?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Anise taught me that trick.
Yeah.
And it's a lot better
Yeah.
than looking at me.
Yeah, well, I'd like to see you too. You know, you can do both. I tried using those backgrounds, but since I don't have a green screen, I find that it distorts my head in very strange ways. So I just dressed up my office a little bit so it wouldn't be too alarmingly messy or crowded.
What do they do with the material after they take it down?
Oh, very good question. Yes.
They sell it.
Another, well, either they give it away or they sell it, some combination. Excuse me. Another aspect of the rules that CHRISTO and Jean-Claude live by is that everything, all the materials that they use for their installations are recyclable and are given back in some fashion or other. For example, I know for running fence, they gave all that material, both the the structural elements, which would have been steel, as well as the fabric. They gave to the farmers to use however they wanted. And yes, they have also used some of the materials as selling pieces. For example, that little sample fabric of the pink lily pad, which was signed CHRISTO. You can be sure that that was something that was sold. And again, that's part of how he funds the next project. Any other questions before we go on to the next section? Okay. So this is another quote from CHRISTO. The real is the real. The work is not a photograph, a finished or an image. It's the real thing. Well, that's partly true, but I think he's also being a little disingenuous there because we all profit from all the photographs and the movies and the books and so forth that have come out of these projects. So it's, I appreciate what he's saying there, that the activity itself is the real thing, but the secondary byproducts give us, still and all give us great pleasure and gives him an income as well. And so I want to take a little bit more time with this hugely ambitious project of the gates, as they're called, which took place in Central Park, unfurled in 2.5 weeks in February 2005. And what they did was they set up 23 miles along all the pathways, not all of the pathways, but many of the pathways in Central Park, which I'm sure you all know was a masterwork of Olmsted, the master gardener and landscape architect of the late 19th, early 20th century. And so what a perfect coming home, because I should say that CHRISTO and Jean-Claude have been American citizens for many, many decades, and they live in Soho like many artists did at that time. And I actually interviewed them back in, I think it would have been 1979. So that would have been just at the beginning of the planning for the gates. And another personal note that I want to put in here. So Jean-Claude and CHRISTO, the three of us were seated around a round table. And so I was asking kind of leading questions about Jean-Claude's role in all this. Now, this was a time when CHRISTO took main billing for his work. It was not CHRISTO and Jean-Claude, it was CHRISTO. And so I was asking him sort of leading questions about addressing Jean-Claude about, so what is your role here, and so forth and so on. And she played the meek little housewife, kind of retreating in the background. Oh, no, 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 I don't have an important role. Well, I mean, I knew that that was, you know, a fabrication, because she's been so important all along to the manifestation of all of his projects. And so it certainly gave me great pleasure as a good feminist when finally, it wasn't until the 90s that they officially and legally in every other way declared that they were partnership, and from there on, their double names appeared as credit on all of their pieces. So you can see it was, the weather changed quite radically in the few weeks it was up. There was a light snow here, a little bit more of a snow here, so that really makes a very dramatic contrast between the snow and the sort of orange saffron color of the gates, as they were called. Now I'm curious to know if any of you people were in New York at the time or had any experience of the gates.
Yeah, I went to visit it. When I lived on the East Coast, yes.
Yeah, good. So remember they started in 79, they're planning. So by 1981, they made their first proposal to the city, the New York City, and it was turned down. And so this is the New York Times article, which we can't read, but it's at least an artifact. City rejects CHRISTO plan for Central Park gates. And the small print says, this is the wrong project in the wrong place and the wrong time. And, you know, it really evidently was an 86-page document explicitly laying out all the different ways in which it was the wrong thing to do. But CHRISTO's initial response to the press was, well, you know, I'm in good health and Central Park isn't going to go anywhere and we'll keep working. So that was his response at the time. And then, of course,
Thank the Lord for Mike.
I'm sorry?
Thank the Lord for Mike Bloomberg.
Exactly. And I have a picture of him. There he is on the opening day, February 2005, with Jean-Claude and CHRISTO, and then Bloomberg, who of course was more, it was, I'm trying to remember, it was Ed Koch, who was the mayor in 1981 when they made that first proposal. And as we know, Bloomberg was much more sympathetic and oriented to the arts than Ed Koch was. And of course there were—
Josephine,
Yeah.
this is Bob. I was there on the first day,
Oh,
on the
cool.
opening.
Maybe we ran
And-
into each other.
Yeah, watched them take it all down. It was a really beautiful, cold day, and saw CHRISTO and Jean-Claude driving around in this amazing automobile. He did not seem to be particularly happy, but anyway. And I was also interviewed by a French TV station and asked for a quote. And the quote that I gave them is, "Everyone is smiling."
Exactly. There was so much pleasure. And I couldn't agree more. And I'm serious, Bob. We may have run into each other because I was actually was there for several days, but I was definitely there at the unfurling at the very beginning. And like you, I saw the two of them racing around in their special, it was kind of like an open air truck or limousine or something, checking all the flash points and so forth. But here they're smiling. And here's my demonstration. I was there and I got a hoodie there. And he made a point of saying that all the little touristic gizmos like the hats and the shirts and so forth that were sold went to support the Conservancy, the Central Park Conservancy. So again, he was, giving back in full. And I know, speaking of my own experience, and of course I'm interested in yours as well, in contrast to the kind of sourpuss reactions of some art critics, I was really overjoyed. This is the only CHRISTO piece where I really participated fully, well, short of being one of the construction people. And over the period of 3 days, I walked almost the entire length of Central Park. Not that I walk all 23 miles of the pathways, but I walked from 59th Street all the way up to, 90, it's not 96, it's 100. Anyway, the top of the northern side of Central Park. And
I think that's 125th.
no, that's Harlem. No, that's way further up from the top of Central Park. But in any case, one of the things that I really took in over that period of time was not only the beauty of the piece, and it really needs to be seen in motion. I wish I could show you videos here of the wind kind of, always moving these curtains back and forth. They tended to be just above, it's not like your head ran into them, but some of them you could barely touch. But so there was that, I think there's another, that sense of being surrounded and yet having plenty of air. You didn't feel like you were encapsulated in any way. And Bob, as you were pointing out, everybody seemed to be so happy. It brought in all different kinds of people, not only out of towners like myself, but people from all different parts of New York. And we were talking with each other. And so it was really a sort of a social transformation that was happening, given this temporary and beautiful environment that made such a contrast. The colors made such a contrast with either the snow that lasted just for a little while, or the gray and the bleak landscape of February, which, there's not much greenery and that kind of thing. So I found that it was a very transformative experience, and to me it was a high point of his career. Any other comments that people have about their experiences are welcome.
Marion, weren't you there at that time? Did
Yes,
you
I
not see it?
was. Actually, I saw it. I had some relatives who lived on one of the streets on the west side, and we climbed up to their roof and saw the entire park on a snowy day. It was absolutely incredible.
Oh,
Then
wonderful.
we came back, the following day when it wasn't snowy, and it was a whole different scene, and the contrast was amazing.
And did you walk in the park at any point?
Walked in the park some of the time too.
Yes.
And
yeah.
everybody was smiling all the time.
Right.
Snow or
Right.
without snow, it was a joyous experience.
Right. And people talking to each other, strangers
Yeah.
talking to each other. I mean, New Yorkers, aren't like that most of the time. They kind of protect their little personal space there. And so it was a very, very different kind of experience. I love this picture here where you see the skating rink
Yeah.
there. And then the gates kind of snaking around to a lot of different places there and over in the background as well. Well, I want to conclude with a project which was not completed and will never be completed. This is a study for a river installation on the Arkansas River in the state of Colorado. And here's the other drawing. It's suspended above the river, and you see a map with some section of the river project there. And I'm comparing it with this poster here, Just Say No to CHRISTO. However, that's not why he withdrew project. He was used to getting lots of no's. Remember the New York Times article on the gates. Because, I mean, people resisted, the environmental people resisted, the politicians resisted, because it was something different. There were too many unknowns, and this crazy guy, and you dream up of an excuse, and probably somebody had it at one time or another. And so this is just the same old, same old. The reason that CHRISTO withdrew this project in 2017 was after the election, because the particular parcel of land that he had already spent about $1.5 million on developing this and getting the permissions and this, that, and the other thing before he withdrew it. And it's also part of federal land. So he decided, if Trump is my landlord, because he's head of the federal government, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. So he even though he had a lot of invested in it, he withdrew it early in 2017 after the inauguration. Well, it seems fitting that a posthumous work that he's obviously been working on for a while is coming back to the center of his beginnings as an artist. And that is the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which you all know. I'm sure you've all visited it. It's right there in the middle of this étoile, all the avenues coming in from every direction. And here are two studies here of how the wrapping might look. So actually, this has been delayed because of the COVID-19. And so will be installed without Jean-Claude and without CHRISTO, as I think of it as an epitaph for their amazing work in October 2021. So put that on your calendar and be watching for all the news that happens at that time. I want to point out that there are a lot of books and documentary films on them. And particularly the films, I think you can get online, directly online from the Oakland Public Library. And the pair of documentarians, the Maisley brothers, did beautiful, wonderful, full-length documentaries on some of the key projects. And to my mind, I'm only showing you some little part of it with these still photographs that his work really deserves to be seen in motion with the fabrics blowing around and people moving and so forth. So I highly recommend that if you want to follow up at all, that you get one of those documentary films that are available at Berkeley or at the Oakland Public Library whenever they might open again. So thanks for your attention. I enjoyed
Josephine,
talking to you and hearing your comments.
could you repeat the name of the documentary filmmaker?
Oh, Maisley, M-A-E-S-L-E. I should have put that in there. But if you, and there are two brothers, I forget their first names right now. But if you look up CHRISTO and Jean-Claude documentaries at the Oakland Public Library, that's where you'll see them. You'll see their name. And they have a package of 5 of their documentaries that evidently come as some kind of a package. 5 different documentaries made by the Maisley brothers. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay, yeah, enjoy. Any
Thanks
other
so
comments?
much. That was great.
Sure, Marianne. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I guess we'll leave the meeting for now. And think happy CHRISTO thoughts.
Thank you so much, Josephine.
You're so welcome.